settings. And we can see that at these settings, the GPUs have fairly similar performance, although the RTX 3080 definitely has a few FPS lead here. Now, also, this particular scene is a bit easier to run than some of the actual gameplay scenes in the game. So even though here it looks like both GPUs are delivering over 60 FPS at 4K Ultra, that's certainly not going to be the case throughout the entire game. Now, as we go out here and he turns the corner here, this is more typical of the performance in the game, where the GPUs are dropping to around 60 or a little bit below. But what I really wanted to look at here was FSR 2.0 versus DLSS quality, since this is one of the few games that support FSR 2.0. Now, 4K, FSR 2.0 does look extremely good, and it's very usable. When we zoom in here, for those of you not on a 4K screen, look at the beard, though. Especially when Kratos breathes out, watch as that breath effect goes over the beard. You can see a little bit of crackling, I don't know how to describe it, but there's a bit of a shimmer to the beard. So there's certainly very specific effects and scenes that still don't look quite as good with FSR 2.0 as they do with DLSS quality. Although overall, I think it's extremely usable, especially at high resolutions like 4K, and gives us a nice performance boost here that I think would be very well worth using. But when you're weighing the value between the two features, DLSS and FSR 2.0, do keep in mind that DLSS still looks a little bit better, and its game support is a lot better. Currently, there's only a few games with FSR 2.0 support, but it only just came out, so we'd expect that to expand rapidly. And now let's look at 1440p and 1080p at the Ultra settings with their native resolutions. Now, do notice that the footage looks a little bit choppy on the far right-hand side. I apologize for that. Sometimes when I record gameplay, the recording doesn't come out very well, but I don't realize that until after I've done all my benchmarking. I've already put the GPU away, and so that happens sometimes. Sometimes people comment on my videos that, oh, the whatever GPU from AMD or NVIDIA looks so choppy in comparison, I wouldn't use that. Keep in mind that you guys are watching a recording of it. You're not seeing what's happening on the actual screen. You should keep an eye on the frame time graphs. You guys notice that the frame time graphs here are incredibly flat and smooth. The actual experience on these screens in person would be incredibly smooth here. So again, when you're judging the smoothness of gameplay when you're viewing a recording, you should always be looking at the frame time graph, not what you actually see in the recording. Now here we're looking at FSR 2.0 at 1440p. Now the lower the resolution gets, the harder the upscale algorithm has to work to look good. I think here, again, focusing on the beard is one of the places that you might see differences. Also looking at the foliage in the background, it looks a little bit more shimmery near Kratos' arm. Things like that. But again, I'm having to really nitpick and look for those details. But my conclusion is still the same, that I do think DLSS does look slightly better in its current form. I hope that FSR 2.0, gets some updates and improves a little bit in the future and gets a lot more game support. Now we'll look at an advantage for AMD, which is Smart Access Memory support. So Forza Horizon 5, I have resizable bar enabled for NVIDIA, but NVIDIA has to whitelist the games unless you know how to get into a third-party app called NVIDIA Inspector and enable it in game-by-game basis, which I'm not doing here because that's not official support. So here with Smart Access Memory enabled, AMD GPUs tend to have a massive performance lead over their NVIDIA competitors in this title. So this is a very popular game, and if you happen to have a Smart Access Memory capable system and spend a lot of time playing Forza Horizon 5, that's one of your main games that you're targeting, this might be one of the things that you want to consider when you're making your GPU choice, because we can see here that in this game, AMD definitely has an advantage. Now, there are certainly other games where NVIDIA has a larger performance lead. Guardians of the Galaxy swings a bit in NVIDIA's favor here, which we can see at the 4K Ultra settings here. But this is also a game that features ray tracing, so we'll certainly be looking at that as well. But first we want to get a benchmark for what this game looks like without ray tracing enabled in order to see what kind of an impact enabling ray tracing has. Because as you can see here at the lower resolutions, the 1080p performance is almost matching the 1440p performance, because you actually get CPU limited at this high of frame rates. And I'm on a 5950X CPU. It's not like the CPU is weak here, it's just that our frame rates are incredibly high. So this game features ray tracing and then has such high performance headroom that you can actually get playable frame rates with the ray tracing enabled. So let's go ahead and enable that and see what happens. Again, the choppiness of the footage here is worse than what you would actually see on the screen, so keep that in mind, although it was a little bit choppy in person. We can see that the 6800 XT at RT Max gets playable settings at 1080p, but NVIDIA gets much higher settings. By dropping the RT down to high, which is actually the lowest ray tracing setting, it's just called high in the game, we can almost match the maxed out ray tracing performance from the NVIDIA GPU. Now, this is a game that actually has console ray tracing support, which is why I think the lower settings are able to give playable frame rates here, even at 1440p for the AMD GPU. So when a game is tuned with some low ray tracing settings that aren't super demanding in mind, you can enable some ray tracing on AMD GPUs. But we can see that obviously the NVIDIA GPU is giving a far superior, far superior ray tracing performance. Now at 4K, the AMD GPU, it's really a non-starter on ray tracing, whereas the 3080 can still max out ray tracing if you're willing to use DLSS and still take a pretty significant performance hit. Now I just played this game on my 3080 12GB, and personally I turned ray tracing off and played it at 4K Ultra settings with no DLSS. Because DLSS still in this game, little details in the distance on my large screen did seem a little bit aliased, and I didn't really like using it. And that's generally my my thought process here. Now let's look at Hitman 3. So this is another title where AMD seems to have a large performance lead when we're not using ray tracing. So this is another one kind of like Forza Horizon 5, where we do see kind of an outsized performance advantage for AMD that's certainly non-typical. Now, again, with ray tracing off, both GPUs are delivering good performance, but AMD does have this significant performance advantage. However, if we turn on some of the ray tracing in this game, now the ray traced reflections are incredibly demanding in this game. So even with the ray traced reflections at low and the RT sun shadows turned on, and using DLSS quality versus FSR 1.0 quality, which by the way is more aggressive than the ultra quality, and if you're watching this on an actual 4K screen, the DLSS upscale looks much better here. We're still seeing the 6800 XT not delivering great performance here. So, that being said, I really wouldn't like the performance here on the 3080 either. So you'd either have to use more aggressive DLSS, which personally I wouldn't really want to do, or turn off the reflections. If we look at 1440p with ray tracing and just using the sun shadows and not the reflections, the performance for both GPUs is a lot more reasonable, and also the performance advantage for NVIDIA, while it's significant here, percentage-wise it doesn't seem to be quite as crazy as it was with the reflections turned on. I've noticed that the ray tracing performance difference between the brands isn't really linear. Like the percentage gap changes depending on how the ray tracing is implemented, especially when it seems like certain heavier ray tracing implementations can kind of overwhelm the AMD GPUs and have them fall off significantly relative to NVIDIA, whereas if you keep them more in check a little bit, they look fine. Now, what I'm looking at here is what if the NVIDIA GPU is running at the native resolution and the AMD GPU is actually using FSR to try to catch up. I was trying to kind of match the frame rates. So what you're taking here is a little bit of an image quality hit for the FSR upscale versus being able to run it at native resolution on the 3080. And we're kind of matching performance here at 1080p. But to be honest, guys, like, why are we, well, at 1080p here, sorry, they're both running at the native resolution. But like, I don't know, using GPUs like this at 1080p just to get some ray tracing enabled at high frame rate seems a bit silly, but you might mainly be a competitive esports player or something like that. And then, you know, you want to play some single player titles, but you have your 1080p, 240 hertz or more monitor, something like that. So I guess, you know, this is worth testing for those of you who have the high refresh rate 1080p set up for esports, but then when you jump into some single player titles. Now, the ray traced reflections in this game, like I said, are incredibly demanding. So if we turn those on, both GPUs are struggling even at 1080p, although I was trying to match 60 FPS here, so notice this is not a apples to apples comparison. The 6800 XT here is at reflections at low, whereas the 3080 I have reflections at medium. Because I was trying to see what would get you, you know, the most ray tracing with playable frame rates here at 1080p, and that's what I was targeting here. So I don't always do apples to apples comparison, so be careful what you're looking at here. Now the AMD GPU still has some significant dips here. Let's look at Unreal Engine 5. People have been requesting this, but I don't usually do it because notice that even at 4K here, I'm reaching CPU limits. So even though I have a pretty crazy CPU here, I'm actually showing you all the cores and threads here this time. We're actually mostly CPU limited, and you might be like, CPU limited, how can you tell? It's only at 36% utilization, but if any of those threads are maxed out, we can't actually increase the frame rate. And we can tell that that's happening because as I reduce the settings, we would be able to reduce the settings or the resolution. You should see a frame rate increase if you if you're not CPU limited. However, unfortunately, that's that when we try that out here. So I change it down to a 1440p upscale in the config file here for the Matrix Awakens demo. Well, this is the city sample demo from Unreal Engine. And this is a compiled version of it that I downloaded. Somebody else compiled it. Anyway, we're not seeing the frame rate increasing. Even going down to 1080p, we're not seeing the frame rate increasing. So this is basically why I haven't really been using this. Now I'm decreasing the graphic settings and we're still at 1080p and we're still not seeing the frame rate increasing. It seems to be the Lumen lighting system that's really having a heavy impact on my CPU and kind of causing a bottleneck. Because when we actually decrease the settings even further and we lose this good lighting, you're going to finally see a performance gain where we're no longer held up on the CPU. Notice our performance actually finally jumps up here with that turned off. But we're actually still CPU limited for the most part. You can see the GPU usage is not near 100% even here. So this is why I generally haven't been using this as a benchmark for GPUs because it's just way too CPU limited. So with that being said, I think that Cyberpunk, while it's not an engine that we'll be seeing used in the future, I do think its ultra settings are kind of futuristic in their GPU demand. So we can see here that at 1080p Ultra, both GPUs are still crushing it at extremely high refresh rate. But at 1440p Ultra, we're certainly still getting a very smooth, a pretty high refresh rate experience. But this game can be taxing even on GPUs this powerful at the Ultra settings, and we have not even enabled ray tracing yet. So that's why I'm kind of using Cyberpunk as a little bit of a what do you expect the GPU demand to be like in a few years down the road if you buy these GPUs now as games get a bit more demanding. So that's kind of the sense in which I'm using this. Plus, it does give us another opportunity to look at things like ray tracing and DLSS and FSR 1.0. This game has been modded to support 2.0, but not officially yet. So here we're looking at the ray tracing at 1440p, and I'm trying out a number of things. We can see basically that this 6800 XT gets absolutely crushed trying to just max out the ray tracing here. The 3080 also gets crushed, but using DLSS quality is at least able to salvage a 60 FPS experience. So you certainly could play this game at 1440p RT Ultra with DLSS quality and it'll look pretty good. Although you are sacrificing a lot of performance here to get that. On the right here, we're looking at some not like-for-like comparisons, but what if we just used RT reflections and tried to use native 1440p resolution? And on the 6800 XT, if I want to use native 1440p resolution, I actually had to go all the way down to RT low, which is really just shadows, like inside shadows. It's not even the sun shadows. So I really don't think it's worth it, to be honest here. So if you're trying to play at the native resolution without DLSS, both GPUs are struggling here, but the 3080 can certainly get a lot more done. And with DLSS, ray tracing is actually fairly reasonable on the 3080 at 1440p in this game. Now, looking at this game at 4K Ultra, this is what I mean by this being an extremely demanding game. Even without ray tracing, these GPUs are struggling to give you much more than a 30 to 40 FPS experience at 4K Ultra. Whereas if we drop down to the high settings and upscale a little bit, here using DLSS quality versus FSR 1.0 Ultra quality, then both GPUs are delivering a very smooth, very good experience. So basically what I'm trying to say here is I think for future titles, these GPUs might struggle a little bit at 4K if you're trying to max everything out. But if you're willing to tweak settings down a little bit and upscale a little bit, you're still going to be able to get very good 4K experiences on these GPUs, I would imagine, for years to come. Just some people have a thing about, I need to set everything to ultra and I'm hesitant to upscale. And if that's the case, there's certainly going to be games where these GPUs do struggle at 4K, especially going into the future. Now, at 1080p and 1440p, these GPUs continue to crush it here, with Red Dead Redemption 2 delivering extremely high frame rates at the maximum preset. And what I mean by that is you just go into the overall performance slider, not individual settings, but the overall control, slit everything to the right to the favor quality side of things. That's what I mean by the max preset here. And they're both delivering such good performance, there's not much to talk about here really. So how about we try out 4K at the maximum preset? And once again, both GPUs are delivering very good performance. At 4K, there might be a small advantage for the 3080 here, but it's nothing particularly meaningful. But once again, showing that especially at 4K, sometimes you get a small performance lead for the 3080. As you go outside, there's certainly more demanding areas of this game where you do drop below 60 FPS on both GPUs, but you can always tweak settings down a little bit. So would I personally spend the extra $100 on the RTX 3080? Yes, I would. I owned both of these GPUs for a long time. I used the 6800 XT as my main gaming GPU for about 6 months back when RTX 3080s cost significantly more. And my most viewed video on my channel is about that decision. And I stand by what I said in that video, which is, when it was like a $500 pricing gap between the two GPUs, I think the absolutely correct decision was to go with the AMD GPU there. But as I said in that video, if the pricing gap was a lot smaller, I would have chose the RTX 3080. Well, at this point in time, the pricing gap is a lot smaller. And at this point in time, I would choose the RTX 3080. Now, to break this down by more detail, and if you would maybe make the same decision or not, let's think about it. First of all, I primarily game at 4K, where we do see the performance lead for the 3080 generally be a bit higher. Also, when you're gaming at 4K, the need to upscale in order to get good performance in some games does become a little bit more necessary in a lot of situations. So having DLSS, which is more widely available than FSR 2.0 and looks significantly better than 1.0, slightly better than the 2.0 version, is really nice. Now, personally, I still try not to upscale unless I really have to. And so there have been some games where I chose to turn off some settings, like not use ray tracing in order to not have to, upscale, things like that. But I played through God of War on my 3080, and I definitely used DLSS quality. I thought it looked great in that game, really boosted performance. It was wonderful. Now, that was before the game had FSR 2.0 support. So now that it has that 2.0 support, great. I still, like I said in this video, think that DLSS quality does look slightly better. And the game support list is, like I said, a lot better. So there's other games, like I'm currently playing Control right now at 4K, and I'm using the ray tracing settings because in that game, the ray traced reflections really do add a lot to the atmosphere in that game. In a lot of games, I don't feel like ray tracing adds much. In Control, I think it does. Now, to get good frame rates, I'm having to use DLSS pretty aggressively, but it's looking pretty good, although I do notice some image artifacting, but I'm willing to take that in order to get those reflections in this particular case. But again, I'm having that DLSS to do that. My 6800 XT would be struggling to run the RT reflections unless I was playing at a lower resolution, and that game doesn't support FSR 2.0. You'd have to like mod it in, and it's complicated. So I'm just saying, I'm definitely noticing a better experience using my 3080 than if I was when I was doing my 6800 XT. That being said, I was extremely happy with my 6800 XT, even playing at 4K when I had it. I just would be willing to pay that extra $100 to get the better upscaling support and image quality and ray tracing performance. Now, that being said, at 4K, I usually turn off ray tracing. The performance hit is still too much. So if you're playing at 4K, I wouldn't weigh ray tracing in there very heavily. Even in a game that had fairly easy to run ray tracing, like Marvel's Guardians of the Galaxy, which I played recently, I ended up turning off the ray tracing in order to not have to upscale and play it at the native resolution, because I felt like the ray trace reflections in that game wasn't really adding a lot to the overall experience, but I was noticing the lower frame rates, and when I was using DLSS, I was noticing a bit of the artifacting and stuff and details in the distance. I do play on a very large screen, so perhaps I'm more sensitive to that than people playing on smaller screens. Now, at 1440p, it's a bit of a different call here. At 1440p, I think both GPUs, if you're not using ray tracing, won't have to use much upscaling unless you really wanted to, which means I think the upscaling features are less important at 1440p. So the 6800 XT is suddenly in much better competition in that case. However, I think ray tracing is more important at 1440p because you're just more able to actually get good frame rates when you're using it at 1440p. At 4K, it's a bit of a struggle in most games. So with that being said, if you're making the decision at 1440p, I think you really need to ask yourself, how interested in ray tracing are you? Because if you are interested in ray tracing, I do think you should go with the 3080. But other than that, the 6800 XT is delivering fantastic performance at 1440p, often better performance than the 3080. And again, you're not usually going to have to upscale if you're not using ray tracing, which means that suddenly the 6800 XT could make a lot of sense here. So really, I think at 1440p, it comes down to, is ray tracing worth an extra $100 to you? The 6800 XT we've seen can do some ray tracing at 1440p with playable frame rates, but you're going to be getting significantly better performance from that 3080. So is that better ray tracing performance worth an extra $100 to you personally? I think that's the choice you're making at 1440p. And some people just don't care about ray tracing, or the games that you play don't even have it, so it's going to be irrelevant to you, in which case save yourself $100 and grab that 6800 XT. Both of these GPUs crush 1080p. If you're playing at 1080p with GPUs of this caliber, I'm guessing you're an esports